Here is Vinta St. John's Laguna, a beautiful, dark, rich red that from the chromatography, I had the expectation of a more classic red. Glad to see I was wrong. There is some tone variation as paper changes, most noticeable on the non-fountain pen friendly stuff. This also comes with some shading, most noticeable on the finer papers, the better papers. Overall, giving a great bold tone on the page. On non fountain pen friendly paper, it stays well behaved with little to no bleeding. Read that as the 20-pound copy paper as an exclusion. And no feathering, which is fantastic. Now, red inks aren't my bag, but dark, rich reds like this one are something of a red outlier. I do enjoy these very much. So, yes, indeed, I would love a bottle of this ink.
The pen for today is a Noodler's Neponset. And now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how we got there by looking at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine.
Dark and rich, that is this red. It does not feather, it does not spread. That smear was totally my fault, not the ink's fault. I ran my finger over it seconds after writing, so not the fault of the ink. Not a ton of shading. There's, moments you could find if you wanted to look for an example, like example, where the EX is a little bit darker than the AM, but it darkened up again at the PLE. But for the most part, we really get a beautifully dark, rich red with just hints of some shading. Looking at the back of the page, no bleeding, no ghosting, easily continuing our notes back here.
Vinta makes more than just one ink. So let's take a look at a few other inks from Vinta.
Here is Vinta Mother of Pearl Nacre. Here is Vinta Tala. Here is Vinta Romblon.
The second writing sample is done in a Portage Reporter notebook.
Looking at this tone, it is just a little bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine, but only a hair. Now, it does not feather and it does not spread. It does not shade on this paper. Gives a very good, very consistent, beautiful, dark, I can't stress that enough, dark, rich red that I am enjoying. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
There's a lot to be learned by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is done the way it's supposed to be done. A line of ink is put down to immediately put into water to show the separation of those colors, making the ink. Now the one on the right is marked with a D. This is allowed to dry for 10 minutes before it's put into water. The third writing sample is done in a national brand Steno notebook.
The tone on the page here is just a little bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine, barely at all. I don't think it's going to come through as different at all on camera because it does tend to change things. The fact that there's no tone shift on this with the toned paper means this is an opaque ink, strong ink with its color. No feather, no spread, no shade, just beautiful performance the entire time. Looking at the back of the page, there is a number of spots where it got very deep into the paper. Now, if it wasn't for these deep spots, I'd say the minimal amount of ghosting that is going on wouldn't be a problem and you'd be able to write back here. But it is these spots that might stop me from doing it, worrying about ruining both sides of notes. However, it did not bleed through touching the page underneath.
Resistance tests are done to see how well this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. Now, this smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. In the upper left, you can see where there is highlighter. In the upper right, that is pen flush. The lower left has a 1/3 bleach solution, and the lower right has plain old water. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
Here we get the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, it does not spread, it does not shade. Though it shaded a little bit on the Clairfontaine, it doesn't really happen here. It does stand out against the quad rule with no problem at all. Doing a great job, meaning if you use quad rule paper, Feel confident in using this ink that the quad rule will melt into the background and you're not even going to be able to notice it. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding, no ghosting, no problem to continue our notes.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at a few more red inks. Here is Ackerman, their number 21. Here is Krishna Manavedam.
Here is Noodler's Red Black.
Here is Roher & Klinger Morinda. All of the inks that you just saw have a review here on the channel. Now, the next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook.
Here we can see the tone is just a little bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does not feather and it does not spread. It does have occasional moments of shading. Take a look at consequence on the first line where the C is darker than the on and beginning of S. The EQ is a bit darker than it happens in the U. The ENCE at the end does get a bit darker. Notice that last E quite a bit darker than everything else. It stands out against the quad rule with no problems at all. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding, no ghosting, easily continuing our notes back here. And if you're a student using this ink, then extra points for you.
While it's nice to see inks that are in the same color family, I prefer to find inks that complement the color on the page. Here is Monteverde Blue Black. Here is Noodler's Lexington Gray. Here is Montegrappa Dark Blue. Here is Sailor Bungu Box Armor Black. The best way you can support this or any channel that you like watching is to alert the retailer of where you saw the product at time of purchase. Now, the last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Here we get a tone that looks almost exactly the same as what we had on the Clairfontaine. It doesn't feather. It's got only the slightest bit of spread. It is 20-pound copy paper after all. We get no shading. We get a great performance. Such a good-looking red here. Still rich and bold. Not that classic red. So good in what's happening. I'm going to say this is a good ink to use if this is the paper you're using, as long as it doesn't bleed and touch that page underneath. Looking at the back of the page, we see that it does get very deep into the page, meaning you could not take notes on both sides of the page. However, it did not bleed through touching the page underneath.
So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink?
The Noodler's Nneponset is a very wet music nib and really showed off the beautiful dark red tone and even delivers on little bits of shading every now and then. Off camera, I went for the polar opposite in a very dry fine and was very let down by the faded red tones, but it did shade much more than the wet music nib. To keep this dark red that I am enjoying, I go for a wet to very wet pen of any nib size. That way I get a tone that I can really enjoy and a little occasional bit of shading, which isn't normally my thing when it comes to red inks.